So this is lecture number 4, Movements for Reform. And I'm just going to leave this up for a minute in case you're writing the outline down. As always, if you're watching the videos, I usually think the best thing to do is to pull up the PowerPoint on something else too, and that way you can sort of go along with the PowerPoint and watch the YouTube bit. So this lecture is about the reform movements of the 1800s. And the reason that this is so important for the course is that the people that we're going to see involved in communal living experiments in utopian societies, they tend to come from this kind of background. They tend to have been, and are, interested in trying to change society, which is what these reform movements are about. In some ways, as we went through the last lecture about 19th century American life, we talked about some of the problems that so upset these people and make them into reformers. And here in this lecture, we'll sometimes zero in on the problems a little bit more and really talk about the scale and the source of the reformers' outrage. And as we move through the causes in here, the reform movements, we'll see that most of them come out of the Second Great Awakening. And what I mean by that is that the Second Great Awakening really inspired this, not just religious awakening, but really sort of brought to people this sense that they should try to change the earthly world. For some, they thought that if they could bring about a sort of sinless age on earth, that would help bring back Christ's return. So for some, the reform movements that we're talking about come out of the spiritual reform of the Great Awakening. So you've reformed yourself, gotten yourself right with God, and now trying to reform the larger society that you're a part of. And, as I said, for many, this is tied to a hope for the millennium, for Christ's return. Some, and as we've talked about before, there's great division about understanding the millennium within Christianity, but some, and sort of a disproportionate number of those who become reformers, believe that if they can bring about a sinless age on earth, Christ returns and rules on earth for 1,000 years. So the reform movements that we'll go through here are efforts to reform society and, as we'll see in many cases, sort of redefine and expand ideas about equality. So these are just some of the movements that we'll talk about as we go through the rest of this lecture. We're starting with education. Education in the colonial period was focused on memorization and recitation. Kids memorized texts and recited them out loud. And then in the early 1800s, of course, many kids learned the entire Declaration of Independence and recited it out loud. And the public schools that existed in the colonial period, in the early 1800s, were only in the northern states, and they were generally one-room schoolhouses. In these one-room schoolhouses, you would have children ages 5 to 19, all in one room together, crowded in, and a teacher who was just an amateur, attempting to sort of supervise all these kids at different levels at the same time. And of course, education only took place over the winter months, because the kids were busy on the family farms the rest of the time. Well, as we move now up into the 1800s, 18 teens, 20s, remember that the cities are growing, and there's a sense that it would benefit society to have better educated people. And the key figure in the public education ideas that spread through the country is Horace Mann. And Horace Mann lived and did his work in the state of Massachusetts. He was first a member of the Massachusetts State Senate. And he really got elected to the Senate with public education as his issue. And then in the Massachusetts Senate, for years, pushed and persuaded, pulled his fellow legislators, trying to convince them to his ideas of public education. And finally, in 1837, apparently we're going to get these all at once. In 1837, Massachusetts became the first state to create a state-funded public education system with a board of education. 1837. And the first Massachusetts Secretary of Education is, guess it, Horace Mann, who doesn't have much interest in the Senate anymore. He wants to lead the state's education system. And the ideas that Mann brought to education were, first, as I mentioned earlier, this idea that education is in society's best interests. It's not just in the interests of the child or the parents, but all of us, even those of us who have no kids, have an interest in educating the next generation. So that's the public idea of it, that we should all be invested in it. Secondly, he rejected the sort of earlier Puritan view and view across other denominations of Christianity that children, like all of us, were sinful. And because they were sinful, like the rest of us, part of the point of education was to break them. And so children needed to have their wills broken. And that was part of the point of all that memorization and recitation. Well, instead, Mann and other education reformers like him believed often that children were innocent and that they needed nurturing and encouragement to thrive. And if children needed nurturing and encouragement to thrive and sort of be the most successful students they could be, well then, it's a very short step to the idea that who would make great teachers? Women, who, as we talked about with all the ideas of separate spheres, are made by God, naturally nurturing and loving and kind and sugary and sweet and stuff like that. So women sort of have education employment opened up to them. And a bonus was that you could pay them less, because there was never the expectation that they had a family to support with that money, like a male teacher would. So male teachers consistently paid usually twice as much. So in 1839, Massachusetts became the first state to create a normal school, which isn't a term we really use often anymore, but a normal school was a teacher training school. And you see, before this, there was never the idea that teachers had to be specifically and professionally trained. You just sort of took the smartest dude in town who would volunteer and stuck him in the schoolhouse with the 5 to 19-year-olds. So now Massachusetts leads the way in professionally trained teachers. They standardized and created a uniform curriculum. And if these sound like things that you're familiar with from your education, almost 200 years after all this, thank Horace Mann. So, standardization, uniform curriculum, teacher training, and the culmination of Mann's efforts in some ways came in 1852, when the state of Massachusetts became the first state to require by law that every child attend public schools. So they create compulsory public education. You can't get out of it, kids. You have to go. And so education becomes not just an opportunity, but coercive in a way. As every kid, I think, has understood at some point. So, man's reforms were imitated and copied across the North and what is now the West, states spreading out to like Ohio, Indiana, Illinois. The public education system does not really penetrate the southern states until after the Civil War. So the expansion you see here of students going to school, the growth that's happening in these green parts, is really the spread of public education in the North. And if you now conceive of the North as stretching all the way out to the Mississippi River, including the new states like Illinois, Indiana, Ohio. So in 1840, 38% of kids were in school. By 1860, it's 58% of kids who are in school. And the interest in education went beyond just public, state-supported schools. Remember that many people live in areas that are so rural, rural is always such a weird word to me when I say it, rural areas that they're so isolated that education sort of has to come to them. And that is what was so great about the McGuffey Readers. The McGuffey Readers, unlike education texts before them, incorporated vocabulary words into stories, so kids use the words in action. And before this, kids learned words in just lists, memorization, recitation. And so the McGuffey Readers sort of take the new ideas about education and bring them in a cheap, because of reforms in printing, in a cheap form that gets even out to the frontier for education for kids. The reforms that started in Massachusetts were imitated across what used to be the New England area, still is the New England area, but across now all of the North. And that means many states imitated the standardized curriculum, the separation of students by age and ability, the normal schools, and the compulsory element of education. Education often taught Christian morals, self-control, punctuality, patriotism, and intolerance for difference. These were sort of values that those in power in America wanted to inculcate in children. And if you want that list again, it would go something like Christian morals, self-control, punctuality, discipline, patriotism, and some intolerance. Now, if you take that sort of lists of values taught in the course of public education, it turns out that industry became supportive of public education too. The factories growing in those northern and midwestern cities wanted workers who had some level of education, who understood self-control, punctuality, discipline,